Well, hello everybody. Welcome back to the channel. Thank you all so much for tuning in. Before I get started here, and as you can sort of tell, this is a very impromptu kind of forecast. It has been a crazy day. I've been running around all afternoon, so this is once again a evening video that's coming out to you guys. And as I mentioned, it is very impromptu. We're going to be talking about a couple of things, but the main focus is going to be, this time, the heat that is expected to build into the central United States and the south central United States as we build towards late this weekend. So, this is not going to be your typical video to where, I make any edits and we, make it all clean and polished. I am going to have a nice thumbnail for you guys, as I usually do. But this video is very impromptu. We're just going to kind of go right into it and talk about sort of what we're seeing right now in our weather patterns and what we expect going into this late week into the weekend. So if you do enjoy today's video, be sure to like and subscribe, share with family and friends who will be impacted by the weather makers this weekend, particularly the above average temperatures that, as I mentioned, is likely to impact the Central Plains and then eventually into the lower Great Lakes by the time we get to this weekend. Also, I want to remind you guys, and also thank you before I even mention this. Thank you guys for 63 subscribers. We continue to grow our community and our subscriber base, so thank you so much for that. I want to also remind you guys that this channel is not going to be monetized. I do have a weather consulting company called Prestige Weather with my partner Ashton. You may know him. He runs the Direct Weather YouTube channel. If you want more information about Prestige Weather Consulting, click the link down below and that will provide you some more information. It's only $5 a month over there. We provide one-on-one weather consulting. We do weekly and daily discussions. And then we also do a weekly lineup of videos there as well, only for those that are subscribers to our consulting services. So if you're interested, click the link down below. But if you're just looking for some weather content here on the YouTube platform, all of this will be free. And in addition to that, if we hit, and not a matter of if, but when we hit 1,000 subscribers on this channel, I will be shaving off all of my hair on the top of my head, and it will be donated to the St. Baldrick's Foundation, and that is a charity that donates hair to those who are suffering from pediatric cancer. It's a very great cause. We are getting closer to 1,000 subscribers. I know it seems like a very tall mountain to climb right now, but I know that we're going to continue to grow and build this community up to that point, and that would be a live stream we do at 1,000 subscribers, is getting all this hair off the top of my head, and we will essentially be donating that to a very, very great cause. But we have to hit 1,000 subscribers first, and hopefully we can do that by the very end of the year, just in time for the holiday season, if not earlier. That all in mind and all announcements aside, let's get right into it. We are using the College of DuPage website. And if you haven't already, please check this out. It is a totally free platform to use, run by the COD Meteorology Department, and it's got a lot of cool features, not just with weather models, but as you can see, with GOES 16 satellite imagery and a whole bunch of different overlays you can use about current conditions. So let's highlight a couple of those tonight. We do have just a lot of easterly flow, or I should actually say southwesterly flow, that's moving through the Gulf and then across the Florida Panhandle tonight. A lot of that convection being out towards the Atlantic, not affecting many in the Northeast New England. Speaking of the Northeast New England, you guys have been pretty dry, at least as of the last day or so. Pretty clear conditions tonight. Some cloud cover making its way into the region. The areas that are seeing the most precipitation are these three: the Midwest, the South Central United States, and then the Pacific Northwest. Let's start first with the Midwest. We have this upper level low that has really begun to occlude and is eventually expected to shear out over time and produce some stratiform precipitation and advance that into places like Western Ontario, Erie, Pennsylvania, and then eventually back towards Ohio. We did have yesterday the potential threat of some landspouts, but we didn't get much of that in northern and central Illinois. A lot of our convection happened late into the evening, so we didn't really deal with much of that, but we did deal with quite a bit of shower and thunderstorm activity. Northwest Illinois and southwestern Wisconsin, dealt with some flash flooding conditions from this slow-moving system. Upwards of 4 to 6 inches of rain within a couple-hour time span. Very, very heavy rainfall. When you get storms to move so slow like they are with this occluding low, usually with an occlusion low, guys, it does slow down, and that also slows down your convection, which causes training of thunderstorms, slow-moving storms, to precipitate over the same areas over a pretty long duration of time. So that is continuing to move off to the east. Thankfully, in places like the lower Great Lakes, we are expecting this to clear out over the next 24 to 48 hours. Our second area that we talked about is in the south central United States along the Gulf shoreline of Texas. You see that a lot of your more robust convection is well off to the south across the international border between Mexico and the United States. A lot of that likely due to that orographic influence. We have higher elevations within this region of north central Mexico. So that's likely why we're seeing more intense precipitation in those areas. But you do have some stratiform showers that were a little bit more robust to begin the evening, but have now begun to die off due to the loss of diurnal heating. This is good news, though. We really like to see this in an area that's been dealing with drought over the last few weeks. I mean, we're talking about extreme to exceptional drought conditions in the south central United States. Now, this precipitation is not going to eradicate the drought. What it is going to do, however, is it does help to sort of rejuvenate the soil and recharge it, so that way it can absorb more precipitation. The question, though, becomes, are we going to see that precipitation frequency increase? I hate to foreshadow this, guys, but I would have to say no. And we'll talk about that here in just a moment. And finally, our areas and friends to the northwest. We have the Pacific Northwest that is dealing with this very strong shortwave trough. Guys, if you were living along the coastline of Oregon and Northern California, right just to the west of the I-5 interstate, you were dealing with some pretty strong winds once that cold front breached over land. Potentially, well, not even potentially, we observed this being strong wind gusts upwards of 50 to even 60 miles per hour in some localities. This is an incredibly synoptically driven system. By the way, if you're wondering how we get such a strong system like what we just saw in the Pacific Northwest, it ultimately comes down to horizontal temperature gradient. That is the temperature difference between the air mass to the north and the high pressure to the south. Well, what's happened is that high pressure to the south has actually meandered and retreated off to the west, just off the coast of Baja California, as our trough then also subsequently ejects eastward. That's why we're not seeing as strong of mid-level flow like we saw when it first came on land. That being said, this system is still very robust. You have all these X's that are demarcated here in our mid-level jet. This is telling us local vorticity maxima. This is areas and local areas and pockets of low-level convergence and upper-level divergence. When we have this type of synoptic feature with all these little vortmaxes embedded within the trough, that's telling us that we still have quite a bit of forcing aloft by our southwesterly winds in the mid-levels, and that's what's leading to that shower and even some rumble of thunder activity in the upper Midwest from Montana back towards the Dakotas. Let's finally put on the mosaic radar just to paint the picture even further, and we'll take off the 500 millibar wrap analysis so you guys can see this a little bit better. For the most part tonight, not a lot of robust thunderstorms, with the exception being, though, around Kentucky and Tennessee, where we do have a slight risk for severe weather this evening. Likelihood of damaging winds and even some hail with these storms. A rather low threat for tornadoes. Let's actually take a look at that right now, and we will deviate a bit because I'm curious to see what the structure of these storms are. Keep in mind, these storms are forming along a cold front in connection with our occluding low that we talked about at the top of our conversation. Let's go ahead and put this in loop here. This is the Paducah radar. Cool feature to note too, you have this outflow boundary that fired off, and you got additional cells to initiate right around the Carbondale region. And these storms overall, you do have a little bit of an inflow notch here towards the very end. And we'll actually stop this towards the end of the frame. You guys can see this a little bit better as opposed to looping it really fast. Here you go, right? So a lot of these are multi-clustered cells. You do have some hooking here, which tells me that there's some low-level veering that we're dealing with. We didn't even look at the 850, but we can in just a moment. But for the most part, this is a lot of multi-clustered convection. We're not seeing much discrete activity. And even if we are seeing discrete activity, like for example, this cell just near Mount Vernon, Illinois, that's going to really just be more of a cellular cluster as opposed to one that is supercellular. A lot of this having to do with the fact that we've lost a lot of diurnal heating going into the evening hours. Let's not forget, folks, it's fall, so we're not seeing a lot of robust development this far north, especially with a system where a low pressure is decaying. We do have a cold frontal boundary, so there is enough forcing for this convection, as well as a nice instability profile. The problem, though, is as far as your kinematic profile is concerned, just looking at our overall storm behavior, this is not enough to produce, a major tornado outbreak of any kind. But considering the fact that our reflectivity DBZs are pretty high with each individual cell, what this tells me is they still are very intense and precipitous. So I would likely insinuate that because we have some sort of inflow notches in a couple of these cells with cell number 1 and cell number 2, I would go on the hunch in saying that we have some plume of moist air advection to where we have a slight veering profile at the surface. But our intensity for our precipitation comes from not just the moisture advection that we're likely seeing here, but also the precipitable water values that are likely for this region. Let's actually hop back to and sort of recap before we go any further, and we'll just kind of look at the mosaic radar. I know I got a little bit sidetracked there, but I was curious about this severe threat. Like I said, these storms will continue to move off to the east, likely posing more of a risk for damaging winds and hail. The SPC at the moment does have a slight 2% for tornadoes, so a very low chance there. And the day one outlook overall is a slight risk. And then as far as our hail and wind problems, at a 15 hail and a 15 wind, I would be willing to bet you, and we'll verify this in a second, that we have some moisture advection regime that has made its way up to this region. It may not be as strong, but it likely is enough to initiate some stronger cells that we're seeing tonight. So let's jump right into that, folks. We're going to look at the models and encompass kind of two things this evening. The first one is the severe threat that will extend into the overnight and eventually be done and conclude by the time we get to tomorrow morning. We'll start first here with the HRRR. Like I said, we'll take a look here at the severe weather threat first, and then we will move on to the rest of the week, which will be very interesting for a lot of you in the United States. So here is tonight, and as you can see, the HRRR is a little bit behind here, as you can tell. I mean, it is sort of underdoing the strength of these cells. We have a lot more robust activity than what the HRRR is outputting right now, so that tells me right away that the HRRR may be a couple of time steps behind. It does have, however, these storms congealing eventually into a cluster, a more quasi-linear segment that eventually makes its way into eastern Kentucky by the time we get to tomorrow morning. That, of course, is a likely case scenario, and then maybe even seeing some additional precipitation on the back end as these storms become a little bit more outflow dominant and produce additional convection upstream and downstream of our original cells. Now, as I mentioned, the one thing I want to check, of course, is our dew point. And as I suspected, without even looking at the overall United States, right, this is a rather huge moisture plume that we're talking about. Let me actually switch this to float 1. And actually, instead of float 1, let's... is it going to let me do Midwest? There we go. So here's the Midwest. And as you can tell, right, here is your moist air advection regime. Currently, if we just go to the 0 hour, there is, right? We do have quite a bit of a moisture plume here. Not surprised by that, so my assumptions were correct. And you do have a cold frontal boundary that does eventually sweep in, although not much change. I mean, this moisture plume really sticks around, and I think that actually speaks to the low, because look at this, guys. This is still your occluding low demarcated by your swirling dew point values in the 60s. So this front is moving incredibly slow. So there might still be another chance of some shower and storm development like the HRRR is hinting at right near Kentucky and southern Illinois by the time we do get to tomorrow morning. Some of those, of course, could contain heavy downpours. We'll lastly here look at the surface-based CAPE to see what our instability profile looks like. And here's your wind barbs too. And this is something to really denote. Let me actually pause that here. We have southerly winds, right? So here's our southerly wind barbs, but then you also have northerly winds. So this isn't really a cold front. This is actually more of a what we call a convergent boundary. When we have colder air to the north converging with a moist air and warm air advection regime from the south, what it does is it actually sets up more of a convergent boundary. Now, as a result of that, this means that we will likely get repeated chances of showers and storms, just like the HRRR had hinted at, and that's because our overall boundary is, in fact, convergent. Now, is it stationary? Not necessarily. It is going to continue to eventually move off to the east, as we can see dignified here by our Cape Plume. Notice that you get more backed winds towards the latter half of tomorrow, and that southerly flow extends more to the northeast, and your cold air wraps around on the back side, pushing your convergent boundary eastward. So this is by no means a stationary convergent boundary. This convergent boundary is progressing eastward, and we do expect that to move once we get into tomorrow afternoon. Let's take a look at the NAM-NEST real quick too and just see if there's any agreement on a reflectivity. And let's actually go to preset. We'll go to simulated reflectivity. There we go. It, by the way, this is 0Z, so this would have been just a couple of time steps ago. Looks like the NAM-NEST actually resolved convection pretty well, a little bit better than what we saw with the HRRR. And as you notice, right, look at additional rounds of showers and storms really hanging around southern Illinois, Kentucky, and the Ohio River Valley, extending even into tomorrow evening. Despite the fact that our low eventually gets sheared out and moves to the east, this convergent boundary still kind of hangs around. It's not necessarily stationary. It is moving east, but it's still in the vicinity to where we can see some redevelopment of showers and thunderstorms by the time we get to tomorrow afternoon. So these areas in Kentucky, southern Illinois, St. Louis, and to the southeast of St. Louis certainly need to be on the lookout for that. Could see, in some cases, depending on the training episodes of these storms, might see some episodes of flash flooding. So remember, turn around, don't drown. If you ever encounter a flash flood, do not drive through it. Turn right around and find an alternative route. Lastly, to conclude our conversation, we are going to talk about the biggest elephant in the room, and that is the expected heat wave that is likely to impact the central United States by the time we get to the end of the week. Now, our current pattern that we have is we have this trough that originally had made sort of landfall over the Pacific Northwest, being sort of sheared out and just kind of gets enveloped within our main jet flow by the time we get to your Friday. And watch what happens with that, right? We get this ridge to build as far east as Ontario and some portions of Pennsylvania and Ohio. This is a classic progressive pattern. This is what we would call essentially a trough, and actually I'm switch to a marker here. A trough, here's our ridge, and here is our what looks to be a positively tilted trough cut off from the main flow. This is going to cause some near record high temperatures for this time of year in many parts of the country, from the Central Plains back towards the lower Great Lakes. We could be dealing with temperatures as far as high 80s and even low 90s, especially for those in Nebraska, Kansas, and the Red River Valley. The lower Great Lakes, there is quite a bit of a temperature spread between, say, the low 80s and even upwards of the high 80s. I expect it to be more on the conservative side of that range, unless you are out in the Corn Belt of Iowa and Illinois. Remember that evapotranspiration, if there's a lot of humidity, you can get warmer temperatures. Only if you have moisture advection. So I'm actually going to correct myself on the fly, because we are not expecting to see a lot of moist air advection in this region. We'll look at the dew points here in a moment, or likely the, let's see. Yeah, I think we'll just look at the temperature for now, and I'll pull up the dew points of GFS in a second. But What I have seen and what makes a lot of sense is a lot of your moist air advection will stay once again in the plains, and then your lower Great Lakes as well as the upper Midwest will have lower humidity values. And like I said, we'll take a look at that towards the end of today's video. Let's look here at the sort of flow moving forward. That ridge sticks around up until the middle to late next week. Now keep in mind, this is hour 174, meaning that these patterns can change, right? This is a lot of uncertainty by the time we get to hour 150 and beyond. So what we know for a fact, or what we are highly confident in, I should say, is that this ridge is going to encompass a lot of the central United States, bringing well above average temperatures. And let's end our video by talking about that. So the GFS, mind you, does kind of sit on the more aggressive end of temperature swings, either cold or warm. It does tend to take more of an aggressive approach with this, so please keep that in mind. But as you can see, going forward into the rest of the week and late this weekend, you see a bulk of that heat really beginning to build in places like the Missouri River Valley and then eventually into the lower Mississippi Valley region. Temperatures likely reaching into the 90s for folks in Kansas and Nebraska, and then eventually making its way into the low to mid 80s for areas of Iowa and Illinois, Wisconsin, and Michigan. As I mentioned, we got to keep a close eye on this, and we'll of course have a follow-up video tomorrow on the latest, but I do anticipate that these temperatures are likely to be on the higher end, and I would say on the lower end, at least in my forecast. So 87, 88, I think this is a pretty aggressive approach by the GFS. I would likely think that these temperatures will be lower by the lake, possibly into the low 80s as opposed to seeing 87s. Of course, we'll keep an eye on the latest model trends and see if that is the case. But one last thing I want to point out before we get to dew points is your temperature anomalies. Look how large of a swing this is for folks in the Dakotas. Typical mean at a time like early Monday morning is 46 degrees in the beginning of October. The temperature in the morning is likely to be in the high 60s, low 70s. Even if we were to apply just a margin of error of say plus or minus, I don't know, 10 degrees, right? Even if we were to apply that margin of error, well, think about it. If I take off 10 degrees from 70, it's still going to be 60. That is still well above average for that time of day, this time of year. So this is certainly going to be well above average heat for the beginning of October. And as I mentioned a couple times already, likely even record-breaking. Take a look at this. This is the upper threshold of temperatures. We're talking about near 80 degrees for Thunder Bay, Ontario for Monday afternoon into the early evening, when the average temperature around this time is 47 degrees Fahrenheit. That is an anomaly of 33 degrees. That is likely record-breaking for an area like Thunder Bay, like an area like Marquette, Michigan, and Traverse City, and Mackinac Island. These are going to be areas that are going to be seeing some uncomfortable heat for this time of year. We do have cooler than average temperatures out towards the Pacific Northwest and Southwest, and that's because of that shortwave trough that digs down and ejects a lot of shower and thunderstorm activity for these regions, and even some heavier rainfall if we're talking about the higher elevations. As I promised, folks, we are going to end today's discussion by looking at the dew points. And as you can see, look where your highest dew points are. They are in the Central Plains and Upper Midwest, whereas places like Wisconsin, Chicago, Indiana, Michigan stay in the low to mid 50s. The vast majority of this moist air advection, the model confidence is pretty high that it's going to be mostly confined to the Central Plains and Texas, whereas areas along the lower Great Lakes are likely to be more dry with their heat. That certainly will make the heat indices in this part of the country, the plains in the South Central United States, feel a lot warmer than in a place like Chicago. We could be talking about heat indices themselves approaching 100 in a lot of these spots circled on this map. We will continue to monitor the guidance. Again, the GFS is very aggressive with our temperatures. The other models that we have in our disposal do have on a more conservative end temperatures in the low to mid 80s for places like the plains with some localities of 90s, and then heat indices reaching as far north as 95 to even 100. So, I hope you guys did enjoy the video. Thank you all so much for tuning into this impromptu weather forecast. I hope you guys did enjoy it. This literally was on the fly as we're talking tonight. I wanted to make sure I got this video out, so I know it's not the typical PowerPoint format, but I do hope you guys enjoyed this and got the most out of it. If you have any questions, feel free to post them down in the comments below. Be sure to like, subscribe, share with family and friends who will be impacted by both the heat as well as the wet weather. And we will see you on our next weather video.